All right, so we'll be starting momentarily once my guest gets here. So one moment, thanks for your patience. All right, how's it going?
All right, how are you?
All right, good. I'm glad that worked.
Yeah.
All right, how's it going?
All right, how are you?
All right, good. I'm glad that worked.
Bit of a delay there. So,
Is your sorry? Do you have the YouTube channel going?
all right, I'm glad that worked. Yep, I did.
Okay.
No, it's going now.
Okay, good. Yeah, because there'll be an echo otherwise. All right, good. And you can have it going. It just if you mute it.
Yeah. No,
Anyways.
fine.
All right. So, yeah, we can discuss whatever. I know we've been going back and forth some on the principle of causality and some other things. So we can talk about that, or if you want to get into another discussion first, and then we could work our way over to that. Or,
I mean, I think I'd be happy starting just back with the contingency argument.
All right, sure.
Yeah. It seems the point that we got to was just the principle of causality, or the principle of sufficient reason, and whether every contingent thing that exists needs a cause for its existence. I don't think that it does. I'm not convinced that it does. I do find it coherent that the idea of an independent contingent thing. But as far as I understand, you were saying that it's broadly logically inconsistent, but I just couldn't see how that was the case. And for me, that it does sort of provide some plausibility to the existence of a independent contingent thing, and it seems to, I guess, state from the conclusion that God exists.
Yeah. Sorry, you were saying it. Sorry, what was that last part? That it does or doesn't lead to the conclusion?
If I believe that if the idea of a contingent independent thing is a coherent and tenable one, broadly speaking, that it doesn't then lead to the conclusion that God exists.
Okay, sure. Okay, yeah, and I've been rephrasing a lot of things. I don't know if you watched my debate last Monday with Brenda.
No, I saw bits and pieces of it. But I didn't see the whole thing.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, she was questioning, and then some others were as well, using the word contingent, because if I could see the modal collapse, then technically things wouldn't be contingent. And then that gets into discussions about free will and such. So I'm happy to reframe the argument just as the sustaining cause for God, and then I don't have to worry about what the word contingent means. And I think in our last discussion, that was kind of where we had reached that, it could work as a sustaining cause, and we wouldn't have to worry about that modal collapse objection. But yeah, the principle of causality seems to be where, we've been disagreeing the most. So, anyways, I'm just looking through my notes. So yeah, the way I define the law of causality or principle of causality is that whatever is contingent needs a cause of its existence or occurrence. So a contingent thing existing due to chance or brute fact would be ruled out. And then the argument that I give for this in my video, and I'm going to redo that video, but anyways, So I give three options for the law of causality: either that it's necessary, which is what I'm arguing, that it can't be violated, so it's necessary, or it's contingent, that it maintains for our universe, but it didn't have to. So it's just because sometimes atheists, people will argue, well, maybe it's just a fact about our universe, but it doesn't apply to the universe. Or the third option is that it's just non-existent altogether.
Yeah.
And then when I say existent, I don't mean existent like a concrete object, but existent like an inviolable rule, kind of like mathematics or something like that. So I think that the necessary, that it's necessary, to me is the most plausible option, because if it's non-existent, to me that would entail that it would just be completely random as to why there would ever be cause and effect. But if it's contingent, then I think there needs to be something that enforces it within our universe, but then to enforce something is a type of causality, so it kind of begs the question there. So to me, non-existent and contingent are ruled out because they're either implausible or beg the question. So that's my argument. I know you object to that, but that's my argument there.
Yeah. I do have, I do object to both to both arguments against the principle being contingent or it being non-existent. I do still find it plausible that it could well be the case that our universe does not cohere with this law of with this principle of causality, that all contingent things must have a cause. And it doesn't seem to me that would lead to randomness or cause and effect not existing at all. It does seem perfectly coherent to me that everything in the universe that is contingent has a cause apart from one thing, and that would be the contingent independent thing that serves as the foundation for all other contingent things. It doesn't seem to me that if the principle is false, that therefore there would be chaos and randomness, and no pattern at all. And with the principle being contingent, that being the principle of causality being true in some universes, well, some possible worlds, but not in ours, it seems to me that there doesn't seem to me to be a need for it to be enforced by something else. I think that's sort of a part of what it means to be independent. If it was truly independent and would not need to be enforced by something else in order to be true in this universe, it would just be purely independent. And if it was, if there was some need for some enforcer, then it would no longer be independent. It would be dependent.
So when you say independent, though, are you talking about the law of causality itself, or are you talking about what you're proposing as like the brute uncaused thing, or both?
Well, I guess this it certainly could apply to both. If the principle of causality is true in if it's true in our world but false in some other possible worlds, and it's the truth of the principle of causality is not dependent on anything else, then it would be independent, even though it's contingent.
Yeah, I mean, I agree it's not dependent upon anything else, because I think it's necessary, or I mean, it could be a necessary aspect of the necessary being. But if it is contingent, as you're suggesting, then it would seem like it would either be contingent because it's non-existent. But if it's non-existent, then I do think that would amount to it's inapplicable. I mean, it truly would be random as to why cause and effect applies at all. But if you're going to say, well, no, it has some reality, but that because cause and effect is so reoccurring, but it's still contingent, it didn't have to apply for our universe. But then I want to know what makes it why is it a fact about our universe rather than not? What's instantiate? And I think that it's different than saying, well, you could imagine an object existing without a cause. I agree, we can imagine that, and there wouldn't be a contradiction. And we can imagine the law of causality existing without a cause too. We can imagine those things, but what would be the implication of that? Because the law of causality isn't a concrete object. And even if it is, it applies to other things. How is it going to apply to other things if there isn't causality involved? And that's where I see it begs the question. If you say, well, it's contingent, but it applies to other things. But if you say it doesn't apply to other things, then that, to me, that amounts to being non-existent, and now we're back to randomness.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm coming from on that.
So, yeah, the question that you raised was why, if it's not necessary, if the principle is not true in every possible world, why is it true in our world rather than not? It seems to me that if the principle of causality is true, and it is true of our world, but not true of other possible worlds, I don't share the intuition that there must be a reason, there must be some explanation. Perhaps there just is no answer to the question why rather than not. But I still don't see why, if the principle was false or non-existent, that it would therefore lead to randomness. I do have a problem with that. I'm not seeing how that follows.
Would you see, though, if it's non-existent, I mean, if something's non-existent, then it has no applicability at all. I mean, do you see that? Okay, sure. So I mean, it seems like there is a reason why we universalize this law. And again, not saying that the law actually exists like a concrete reality, but it seemed like we universalize it because there is a consistency. We say, okay, effects always, there is a regularity to things, so we come up with this law of causality. Yeah. So it seems like it has some kind of reality. Again, more akin to like how mathematics does or the laws of physics do. But so then to me, it seems like the non-existent approach does seem implausible, but you could take a contingent approach. You could say, yeah, it's part of our universe, but contingently. So, I mean, do you see that those two, would you say you go more one of those routes? Or do you see them?
I don't commit myself to either one. I certainly don't claim to know, but I'm leaning towards sympathizing more with the principle not being true of our universe, that not every contingent thing needs a cause. Perhaps there are some contingent things that don't need a cause, and it still seems to me to be wholly tenable.
Well, yeah, I mean, I want to move away, though, from the idea that like a contingent thing could lack a cause. I mean, I agree that that's conceivable, but like, for example, every time I turn on the faucet, water comes out. It seems like there's some undergirding principle there that happens every time. I don't think it's just by chance. So there's either a necessary connection there, not that it would have to be that type of connection, but that the cause and effect is necessary, or that the cause and effect maintained is contingent. Otherwise, it seems like it would truly be random that every time I turn on the faucet, water comes out. I don't think it's just random. I think there is some sort of causal connection there. Would you agree with that?
Certainly, I think that perhaps under the view that that I might be proposing, that that there is that if you trace the chain of contingent things backwards, eventually you'll come to some independent contingent thing that's uncaused. Then, in that sense, the cause and effect relationship between turning on the faucet and water coming out would ultimately be random, because the first contingent thing really exists for no reason and is the way it is for no reason. So ultimately, it would be random. I don't find that to be too much of an issue, though.
Right, it would be random because the first contingent thing is random in your view, but the first contingent thing is still the cause of other things, though, in your view, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we would still have cause and effect within this.
Sure.
Okay, so to me, it seems like cause and effect still is a part of this system. It's just a part of it contingently, in your view. It doesn't apply to the first contingent thing, but it applies to many of the other contingent things, on your view, right? Or would that be correct? Okay, so sure. Okay, so it seems like, and again, the way I've mapped this out is just the way that I haven't found this in other literature, so this is just kind of the way that I'm piecing this together to sort out my thoughts. So it seems like under my categories, which I posted in the chat there, that you're taking the view that the law of causality is contingent, that it is a part of reality in some sense, but it doesn't apply to everything within reality. Would you say that's fair?
So the principle of causality was every contingent thing that exists has a cause for its existence. Would that be correct?
Right, but you could, well, every contingent thing, yeah, but when I say it's contingent, you could say every contingent thing under a certain subset. So every contingent thing within the universe. I mean, I don't mean, when I say it's contingent, I don't mean that it thereby applies to everything. I mean, it thereby applies to a certain subset of things, like our possible world. You wouldn't have to apply it to the first thing under your view. I just mean that it has a contingent application.
The principle of causality is that every contingent thing that exists has a reason for its existence. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I mean, usually that's called the principle of sufficient reason, but I'm calling it the principle of causality to kind of help us cut through some of that language.
Yeah. Could you ask your question again?
Sure. Sure. So yeah, when I say that you could be committed to the position that the principle or law of causality is contingent, what I mean by that is that it maintains within our universe, or at least it maintains to a large portion of our universe. I don't mean that you're committed, because by saying it's contingent would mean that there are some things that it doesn't apply to, like the first thing, but that it does apply to a large subset of things. It's just not a universal law. It's rather it's applicable to some aspects of reality and not others.
Sure. So I wouldn't commit myself to saying that the principle of causality or the principle of sufficient reason is true of our world, but I maybe want to commit myself to a proposition which is slightly less ambitious, such as almost all contingent things have a reason for their existence, or all but one. But that is distinctly different from the principle of causality or the principle of sufficient reason.
Right. So yeah, I would call that then the contingent view of the principle of causality, that it maintains for a large aspect of reality, or maybe for things within our universe, or a large number, but it doesn't apply to absolutely every possible world or absolutely everything. Okay. So it seems like then we can set aside the non-existent view, or what I'm calling the non-existent view, and we can focus on the contingent and necessary view. So my view being that it applies to every single possible thing and situation. So, and then my argument against why, and I'll post this in the chat too. My argument against why I don't think it can be contingent is that I think it ends up begging the question, because, I just did something weird here. And the reason why I think it ends up begging the question is because I think in order for it to apply at all, then I think it has to, wow, I think that got chopped up. Anyways, okay. In order for it to apply at all, then it has to apply altogether, because, and I know that you object to this argument, but because what's going to enforce it for certain portions of our universe? And I know you say, well, maybe it doesn't need to be enforced, but I don't see how it's going to apply if it's not enforced. Like, I could imagine a particle just existing without a cause, and there's something incoherent about that.
Yeah.
But the law of causality is not like a particle, but even if you argue that it is kind of like that, and somehow, what's going to apply? How is it going to apply to other things unless causality is necessarily the case? Like, what's going to make it be the case? It's going to have no control over anything if it's not already applicable, is my argument.
Yeah. So I agree that the principle of causality, the principle of sufficient reason, this proposition which would describe the universe, and it doesn't. I wouldn't describe it as having control over anything or having any causal properties whatsoever. I don't think that the reason that, for example, when you turn on the faucet, the water comes out, is in any way caused by the proposition. So it seems to me that this proposition is just a description of the way the world is, And we can always ask the question, why is the universe such a way that almost all contingent things have a reason for their existence, and not all of them, or none? It seems to me there might just be no answer to that question. It might just be the way it is, and there's no reason at all.
Right. So I don't think that the principle actually does cause other things. I think that would be a problem for the contingent view, though, because if it's only contingently applying, then I'm gonna want to know why it applies in those situations and not another situation. And to me, it seems like then you would have to invoke causality as to why it's applying in situation X and not situation Y. Now, under my view, it just necessarily applies. It's just a necessary part of reality, of metaphysics. It doesn't cause anything to happen. It's just the way things have to be. So I actually think the necessary view in that sense is more plausible, because we don't have to invoke some extra thing to explain why causality is regular. It just has to be.
Yeah, sure. It's still thinking that there doesn't, there really doesn't need to be any reason, or that perhaps there is none.
But okay, so if you're going to say that perhaps there is no reason why the principle of causality applies within our universe, or largely applies within our universe, I mean, I don't know. I feel like then that collapses into the non-existent view almost. It's like, because I'm wanting to know what's different about the water faucet, that it's operating with causal regularity as opposed to not. I mean, are you going to say there's some feature? But if you're going to say there's some feature, now seems like we're back to causality, that now we're back to some regulating principle. Otherwise, I mean, it really does seem like it would be random that I turn on the water faucet and water comes out. To me would be the no reason. It would really be just random that happens.
Yeah, and I think if you take a sort of immediate, a short approach, then there is a cause, there is a reason that water came out of the faucet when you turned the handle. But under the view that contingent, independent things exist in our world, and serve as the foundation for all our contingent things, ultimately, the fact that water came out of the faucet is random. Ultimately,
right, it's ultimately random. But are you saying it's ultimately random because that actual causal regularity in that situation is random, or it's random because there is this brute thing that just happens to exist that causes everything else? Is that why?
The latter. Yeah, brute fact, because it itself has no reason for being.
Right, but are you saying it's just the first thing that has no reason, or the thing that it causes also have no reason?
No, I think because the things that it causes have a reason for being, and that is that they were caused by that thing.
Right.
But, yeah.
Right. So I'm arguing then that first thing, if you're going to argue that first thing's a brute thing, how is it going to cause anything else if the principle of causality doesn't already enforce? If the principle of causality is going to be something's going to have to either regulate it, or it's really just going to be random that thing is able to cause anything. Or in my view, it's just necessary. Causality just has to take root.
Yeah, I don't. It seems to me that there doesn't have to be a reason. I don't see the need for irregularity. It seems to me that it can just be that this contingent independent thing can just be such that it causes other things, and there is no reason that it does this.
Okay. I mean, we can move on. I think we have a different intuition on this. Just to repeat, though, just to summarize my position. So, I mean, I see that either this sort of contingent view ends up boiling down to the non-existent view, which to me, it would just be utterly random why causality would take place. Or it seems like you could be arguing that perhaps the first contingent thing causes other contingent things to behave or exist and so on. But then I'm going to wonder, well, why does that thing's causality take place? And then if I have to appeal to another outside source, then it seems like it's just going to go into infinite regress. It's like, well, what's going to make causality apply in that situation rather than not? And then it's going to start the conversation all over again. Yeah. Or you're going to say, well, it's just random. It just happens to be that causality works in that situation. But I'm going to say, well, what extra ingredient is there that causality works in that situation and also works so regularly? It's not like sometimes I turn on the faucet and water doesn't come out, and sometimes it does. What's that extra factor? And it seems like if you invoke an extra factor, well, then you're invoking the principle of causality. And if you're invoking the principle of causality, it seems like that is invoking causality. You're saying, well, the principle of causality makes it work in that situation. But if you say, well, no, I don't want to say the principle of causality makes it work in that situation, I'm like, what is that extra factor? And I don't know, to me saying it's just a brute factor, just happens to work, to me that does end up seeming like it is just truly random. Like, I don't know. But anyways, I don't know if you have anything else to add, but that's where I'm coming from on that.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. But it seems to me that there doesn't. I don't see any requirement for an extra factor, for that extra ingredient. It just. I think that implicit in that is a proposition saying that there must be some extra factor to explain it. But I reject that. I don't see that we have sufficient justification to say that there must be a factor which makes causality and behave the way it behaves.
Okay, so just one more question on this. So imagine you're in universe X, and that's the universe where every time you turn on the faucet and water comes out. But then you're in universe Y, and universe Y is all the same as universe X, but because the principle is contingent, when you turn on the faucet, water doesn't come out. But to me, it seems like, I don't know. That just cries out for an explanation to me. Like, why is it every time in universe X the water comes out, but every time in universe Y it doesn't? But you're going to say that that's just a brute fact, that there is no difference between the two universes?
I agree that it's not a satisfying conclusion by any means. I think most people will say that it does cry out for an explanation. They want to know they would like to know why, but that might not be reflective of the way the world works, or desire for an explanation might just not cohere with the way the world is. There might be no reason at all.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I just find that to be really unlikely, but okay, we have a different intuition there. All right, let's move on to a different argument.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't know, did you have one that you wanted to discuss, or I know we didn't get into... Sure, go ahead.
There is another one argument I would be interested in asking your thoughts about.
Sure.
Yeah, that would be the argument against God existing, the deductive argument from evil. I was just wondering.
Okay, sure.
So that would sort of go premise one: if God exists, then evil and suffering would not exist. Premise two: suffering exists. Conclusion: God does not exist. That's the way. But I'm sure it'd be premise one that you would object to.
Right. So I want to make sure I repeat this. So premise one: if suffering exists, then God does not exist. Was that the full version of that? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the deductive argument from evil. So yeah, I mean, I think that there are responses to that. And I don't know if you watched my video on that, but I have my own response. And of course, a lot of times there's a distinction between the logically deductive and then the evidential, more inductive version. And I don't think that distinction is that crucial, but it is there. So, I mean, I would argue, let me ask, did you watch my video on this?
No, sorry, I have not.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, so I have a kind of unique approach to it. I'm not saying it's going to convince everybody, but so I argue that some of the approaches, I'm trying to pull up my slides here, some of the approaches fail to adequately respond, but I argue for a kind of free process type view, which is that it's kind of like applying free will to everything. And not that I think everything has free will, but kind of like the free will defense argues that, God couldn't force somebody's will.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you're familiar with the free will defense.
Yeah.
And I think that works in terms of explaining moral evil, but it doesn't explain natural evil very well. So I argue then that God couldn't force nature as a whole, for our pre-heavenly universe, to conform to his will, so that kind of the free will defense applies to all of reality. I mean, not God, but all of created reality. And not that nature has free will, but argue that like in heaven, people will be in perfect relation with God.
Yeah.
But he couldn't force people into that relation. But in heaven, everything will operate according to God's will. But he can't force beings into heaven, though. So he has to start beings out in a universe or reality where not everything operates according to God's will. But that type of reality is going to be one where there's going to be possibility for natural and moral evil. So it's kind of like applying the free will defense to everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
I need to get a cord. I'm still here. I'm just stopping my camera for a second. Cool. You can talk. I can hear you.
Cool. Whether or not the free will defense, I think sufficiently explains away moral evil. I'm not too sure about it. I would like to get into that, but I certainly don't see that it explains away natural evil. I don't see that the existence of free will in any way saves us from things like earthquakes, tornadoes, things like that. Such things cause suffering, and it seems that the world would be better if they did not exist, if they did not happen. And if God is the greatest conceivable being, then he ought to be able to produce a universe in which natural disasters don't happen. That would seem to be my position in natural evil.
Yeah, I agree that it's within God's power that he can create a universe without natural evil. So my argument's more that he couldn't just like he can't justifiably force somebody's will, would be my argument in regards to moral evil. I'm going to argue that he can't force beings to enter into. So part of the free. So sometimes it's argued with the free will defense that free will is so good that God would give us free will, and I don't take that approach. I don't think it's that free will is so good. It's that God, in his justice and his love, wouldn't be able to morally force our wills to enter a relation with him. Okay, so I'm arguing that heaven would be a perfect relation with God, and everything, not only are beings in a perfect relation with God, but there also won't be any natural evil because everything operates according to God's will. But in order to so he can't force beings into that perfect relation. So he has to start beings out in a non-heaven or pre-heavenly universe. But a pre-heavenly universe is a universe where things are not perfectly conformed to God's will. But if they're not perfectly conformed to God's will, then I'm saying that applies not just to our will, but it applies to all of reality as a whole. So if heaven is the reality where everything operates in perfect harmony with God's will, then the universe or the pre-heavenly universe is going to be a reality where not everything operates in perfect harmony with God's will. And if things don't operate in perfect harmony with God's will, then that entails there being a possibility for natural and moral evils. I'm not saying there aren't objections to that, but I think it's helpful if you watch the video.
Yeah.
But anyways, that's my argument.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks. That makes a lot of sense, but it does still seem to me that if there existed a maximally great being and he would produce a universe, he would produce one in which the natural side would be in perfect consistency with his will. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree that he could do that with his power. I'm arguing that it would go against his moral nature, though. And I'm not saying that this is straightforward, like I can prove this. I'm putting it forward as like a theory that his moral nature prevents him from. So imagine like on one side you have a perfect universe and call that heaven, and everything is operating according to God's will. And then you have the created reality or the pre-heavenly universe, and we'll just call Earth.
Yeah.
And everything operates there, not in accordance with God, or not in perfect harmony with God's will. So God would have the power to override the inconsistence or the natural evils and disorders and such. But the only way that he could justifiably do that would be by forcing that reality to perfectly conform to his will. So I'm saying there's a kind of divide. It's like everything operates in accordance with his will perfectly, or he creates a reality where it doesn't. But if he creates a reality where it doesn't, then that kind of opens the door to these other imperfections. So it's kind of like one or the other in a way.
Sure. And I'm seeing that you're saying that it's part of his nature. This universe contains evil as sort of a result of God's moral nature, but it seems that a maximal great being would have a moral nature such that they would produce a universe that contains no natural evil.
Sure. Right. In an immediate sense, yeah, like heaven, yeah. I mean, but the argument is, I'm arguing that perhaps that God couldn't do that because by doing that, it would be forcing the world to conform too much to his will. So there's this kind of, just like some Christians will argue, well, God can force our wills. And I would say, yeah, he could, but that would go against his nature. It'd go against his justice. So if somebody says, well, okay, but he could force the laws of nature, though, to prevent natural evil, I'd say, yeah, he could, but then he could be overstepping his boundary between the relation between himself and the pre-heavenly universe, because then he would be forcing those laws to conform to his will. And by doing so, it would be forcing us more into the heavenly universe. So there's this kind of divide. If he's going to create a universe where things don't perfectly operate in perfect harmony, then that kind of opens the door to these imperfections. He kind of has to let the universe not run on its own because he sustains it, but it's kind of like there's a synergy between the laws and between his will. So they kind of, like if you imagine like on a scale, like in heaven, say the laws operate at an A+ level. But in order to create a non-heavenly universe, he's got to create a universe where things are operating at a C level, and how much they conform to his will. Yeah. So, but if he creates something that has to operate at a C level, then that's going to open the door to natural evil. And it seems like, well, somebody could argue, yeah, but maybe God could intervene and do miracles and such. But I'm arguing that that's part of the universe as well. Like so this applies to his interventions as well. It's all about a relation. So it's like if in heaven everything is at an A relation, then there would be no suffering. But he can't force beings into heaven. So he creates a universe where things are at this sort of C relation. But if they're at a C relation, then he can't perfectly force things to conform to his will. And I'm saying it kind of opens the door to other imperfections and such.
Yeah. Not that it does make a lot of sense. And I like that response, but it does seem then that God has a reason for allowing natural evil. It's certainly just intuitively, it does seem to me that a maximal great being would not have such a reason.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go
ahead. I was just going to say that I do have some smaller problems. Just things like we might not be able to come to an agreement on this or go into a lot of detail about it, but it does seem to me that a maximally great being would produce a universe containing no suffering, natural or moral. And in that sense, free will might not exist, but it seemed to me that a universe that free will doesn't exist might actually be better than one that doesn't. But that's just sort of an emotive intuition of mine. It's not something that I can prove. But yeah, these issues do sort of that they are one among many, I guess, roadblocks and for me to being convinced that God exists. But yeah, that's That's sort of the problem of evil.
Right. So yeah, there's a few things there. So when you say that a maximally great being wouldn't have a reason for allowing suffering, it seems like you had said something like that. So I agree that if it was a volitional reason, like it was just something he was choosing or something, then I agree with that. But what I'm arguing is that it's an intrinsic part of his nature. So he doesn't have a choice over that. And it's not that it's a part of his nature to cause suffering, but I'm saying it's a part of his moral nature of his relation to creation. If he chooses to create, so he doesn't have a choice over that. And it's kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with the philosopher, theologian Thomas Ord. He argues something similar to this. So there's a book, he's written several books, but there's a book called 5 Views on the Problem of Evil you might be interested in checking out. And it has like William Lane Craig and some other people that give like, it's one of those 5 Views book where they have like different perspectives and argue back and forth. That's pretty good. But anyways, my view is kind of inspired by Ord's view, but the issue I have with Ord's view is that his view goes too far in the direction that God like lacks power. Like God doesn't have any control, excuse me, any control over the laws themselves. Like they have this kind of necessity to them. And I think that goes too far. So my view is a more modified version of his view. It's not that God lacks the power, but it is still a part of his moral nature that prevents him from being able to prevent suffering. And I know that's not how most theists respond, but I think that that's a consistent way to respond, because most theists will respond that way when it comes to free will. They'll say, well, it would be against God's nature to violate our free will, and I agree with that. So then I try to apply that to natural evil as well. But the other thing you had said was you think it would be better if the universe lacked free will. I actually agree with that, but I would say that it wouldn't be moral. So I would say that God couldn't morally do that. So I don't argue in terms of, so a lot of times on the problem of evil, people argue in terms of greater good. And I think that's a mistake. I think it would be, I don't think suffering leads to any necessary greater goods. It's that God has moral obligations that he has to fulfill, but it's worth it because of the greater good overall of willing heaven for, beings. So anyways, that's how I would respond to those.
If I understand the universe contains natural evil and it contains moral evil, not because of a volition of God, but because it's a part of his moral nature. It's just a part of the way it is. But it seems to me that a maximally great being would have a different nature. I think I would put it as simple as that. A maximally great being would have such a nature that any universe they produce would contain maximal pleasure, happiness, things like that.
Sure. Yeah, and I agree that that's true in some sense. Like that's what God is working to achieve, but a maximally great being also has obligations to justice. So like just as violating free will would go against his justice, I'm arguing that perhaps violating the laws of physics for our universe to some degree, like again, it's an overall perspective, that would violate justice as well. So it's that God's obligation to justice. I gotta get some water. I'll be right back. Go ahead. I can hear you though.
Yeah. It does seem to me then that God's obligation to justice is a bit of an unfortunate roadblock to sort of maximum pleasure, maximum happiness. And it seems to me that any maximally great being would not have this roadblock to producing maximum pleasure and maximum happiness. They wouldn't have this obligation to justice.
Sure, but how do you know that though?
I don't. It's just I do sort of take an emotivist approach to values and morals. So that this is my picture of a maximally great being. It's it is just purely subjective to me.
Sure.
So yeah, it's not that I couldn't put it into a deductive proof because I couldn't prove the premise that a maximally great being wouldn't do X, for example.
Right. So it seems like then, I mean, my view then would be that you wouldn't be able to strictly maintain the logical problem of evil.
Yeah.
You would maybe move to more like an evidential problem. Would you agree?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. And I agree the evidential problem has force. I mean, well, I don't want to say definitively, but if one has no good reasons for believing in theism, then the evidential problem would be a strong reason against theism. But from my perspective, I feel like I have strong reasons for theism. So when I'm approaching the problem of evil, I go, okay, there's some explanation I can come up with against the logical problem. And yeah, the evidential problem has a lot of force, but it could be wrong. So if I feel like my theism reasons are stronger to me, then it's gonna So I look at it as kind of like a seesaw, where it's like on one side you got the atheistic arguments, like the problem of evil. The other side you have your theistic arguments, and I see them as balancing out. Like maybe the problem of evil, let's say, gets up to like an 8 or a 9, like it's pretty strong. But I feel like my other arguments get up to that, maybe a little bit higher, and that's going to. Okay, somebody just messaged me. Okay, I'll talk to them. Okay, so the problem of evil then kind of goes down on the seesaw a little bit. But so you kind of got to value, and a lot of philosophers will argue that you kind of got to approach them all together. You got to look at all the arguments. So it seems like probably from your perspective, you're not as convinced by the theistic argument. So the problem of evil has a little more weight. Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there was one response to the problem of evil that I heard, and I was just wondering what you thought about it. I think it was Cameron Bertuzzi from Capturing Christianity. You know Cameron Bertuzzi, yeah.
Yeah.
I can't remember where I heard him say this, but I'm sure he said that he sort of gave an analogy for why God would allow the existence of evil, and he said that imagine a parent taking a child to the dentist. That was the analogy that he used, and that the child may experience a lot of suffering at the dentist, but it's for some greater good of avoiding other evils such as tooth decay and enamel, things like that. But that I was wondering what you thought about that. My sort of initial thoughts about that were that a maximally great being would not produce a universe in which tooth decay exists and must be overcome through sort of minor suffering in comparison. That the universe would just exist without, as an analogy, tooth decay.
Yeah. Well, I know What Do You Meme did that response video with the Cosmic Skeptic and things, and then that analogy was brought up. And yeah, I think analogies like that, like it's that whole greater good response to the problem of evil. I think it's just totally mistaken. I mean, I think theists need to get off that boat. So like, there are a lot of philosophers Christian theist philosophers who critique that approach, like David Bentley Hart and Bruce Little, and the names are escaping me at the moment, like Greg Boyd. I mean, there are others, but
yeah,
Kirk McGregor, and he was on Capturing Christianity. It's like it doesn't seem like suffering. It seems like God could bring about the greatest goods without there being suffering. The greatest goods being all the goods we think of as heaven having. So any sort of like greater good approach, I think it's just mistaken. Like that's where I don't argue. Oh, Eric Rattan is another guy I was thinking of. He has a great paper critiquing the greater good approach and why it doesn't need to be taken. And yeah, that's how I would approach that. So like the tooth analogy and any analogies. So a lot of times it's like a shot analogy. Like, would you put your child through the pain of getting a shot? It's like, well, of course, but we're not all powerful. We didn't set things up. So yeah, I don't like those types of arguments as much.
Well, I guess I agree there. There's one more question I might have for you. So just sort of slightly earlier, you did ask the question, how do I know that a maximally great being, would not produce or would not have a nature in which he has certain obligations to justice, and I do wonder how certain properties are, well, I guess I could ask the same question to you in a certain way. I guess, how do you know that a maximal great being would have properties such as love and intelligence and beauty and things like that? How do we know that they are good objectively?
Sorry, how could he know all the goods?
Or how could we know that a maximally great being must have a certain set of properties? How do we know that? How do we know that love is objectively good? Intelligence. That's sort of
yeah. Well, my view, arguing like what I argue with the argument from contingency, is that that God doesn't have any limitations.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Right. So I think like that approach, and I'm not saying it's illegitimate, but I feel like that approach more kind of extends from the ontological argument, that type of reasoning where it's like God's attributes are the attributes we consider to be the greatest. And I don't disagree with that approach, but to me that does raise the objection. It's like, okay, well, it's kind of subjective. And I don't think it's subjective, but I get like how that could be an objection. I don't know. I guess what I'm thinking is like that type of like greater being approach is more grounded in the ontological arguments reasoning.
Yeah.
And the reasoning that I offer more along the contingency route is that God's attributes are he just has every attribute. And I'm in a debate with somebody right now, so I want to be careful. He has most attributes unless they are secondary attributes, but I don't want to get into that right now. But anyways, love and intelligence and so on would be attributes that he would necessarily have because he just has all those psychological attributes.
Okay. But yeah, I guess that does answer that question. Certainly going down the sort of contingency route. He must be unlimited, so he must have all properties.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we spoke about this earlier, but there does seem to be another issue for me with sort of distinguishing between what really is a genuine property and what's the absence of one. For example, if God is unlimited and therefore no properties, he might be, it seems that it may lead to some sort of ridiculous statements such as God is maximally. I don't know. He's well, yeah. I can't think of anything right now. But I guess maximally, maximally moronic or something like that. He's maximally fluffy. Let's use that as an example. Maximally fluffy.
Sure.
It seems it could lead to something ridiculous like that.
Right. Yeah, and that's the debate that I'm having with somebody right now on the debate I just did. But anyways, so I have a couple of ways to approach that. So one is that fluffiness is itself a limitation. So, or at least it has limitations in it, because you would have to be within space to be able to be fluffy. So if God is spaceless, he can't be fluffy. But if somebody then said, okay, but there's more to being fluffy than just being in space, then I would say, okay, well, what is that? And if they say, well, I don't know, but there's something about it, I would say, okay, well, God has that, but I don't know what that is. But there's another approach where you could say, so I'm making this distinction between fundamental limitations and more secondary properties. So like, for example, some properties seem like they need other limitations. Like to be fluffy, then you would have to be limited by space. But if God's not limited by space, then he can't be fluffy. But fluffy is more of a secondary property. So he doesn't have these secondary properties, but that's because he has no fundamental limitations. So when I say he has no limitations, he has no fundamental limitations. So that means he's spaceless. So at that point, no, he's not fluffy, but being spaceless doesn't rule out being loving and kind and so on. So I don't know if that was too fast. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly for that example I used, that certainly explain that away.
Yeah, and I think there are some other ones as well. There's several different types of objections, and I try to go through a few of them in my contingency video of the ones that usually get raised, but I think they can all be harmonized. Like sometimes I think a lot of times there are properties that people invoke that aren't real properties. So those are sometimes called Cambrian properties. So like Thomas Aquinas talks about, like standing left of a column would be a property that God would lack, but it's not a real property. That's just like a concept, like a statement you would make. So God doesn't have the property of standing left of a column, but there is no property. So Aquinas actually argues that the property of creator couldn't properly apply to God because God isn't necessarily a creator. But he would say that's not a real property, though. That's just like a description of something God did. And I would agree with that. So anyways, there are a lot of objections along those lines.
Okay, well, allow me to pick your brain one last time.
All right.
I watched your video on free will, and there was there was an argument against existence of free will, which you objected to. I can't remember the exact details of it, but it was the argument from desire. That was our actions are controlled by our desires. We don't control our desires, and therefore we don't control our actions. That does seem to me to show that we have no free will. I take it you wouldn't agree, but it does seem to sort of play into other things, such as the problem of evil. We might not have free will, etc. I don't know what you think about that.
Excuse me. Yeah, so I think with the problem of evil, like technically speaking, I don't think that we necessarily have to have free will in order for the response that I gave earlier to work. Somebody could still be a compatibilist, I think, and still offer that argument I was given earlier. But I do think we have free will, and I think that makes more sense in thinking about the problem of evil. But yeah, that argument from desires. So yeah, usually it's not called that, but I know that sometimes it gets framed that way. Like Cosmic Skeptic had that video about free will, and he argued something like that. And yeah, I don't think that argument works. So it's like, because it's like, okay, say I want to go to the movies or I want to hang out at home. Like those are both competing desires, but it's not like one, like they're different desires. It's not like one has to be stronger than the other and overrule me to stay or do or go to the movies. Like, I feel like it's more plausible that I just pick between one or the other, and I have that power because I have free will. Like,
yeah.
I don't see how. And then usually the objection I get back is, oh, well, that would be random. Then it would just be a random choice. But I just don't see how that. It depends on what you mean by random. So if somebody by random means, oh, you're out of control. Well, to me, that begs the question, because the whole view of free will, at least under an agent causation view, is that I am the originator and I'm the controller of my choices. So it wouldn't necessarily be that. But if by random they just mean that it doesn't have some determining factor, like it's just up to me, it was somewhat arbitrary, okay, then I agree. But I don't see why that's incompatible with free will. So I just feel like I get where those objections are coming from, but I just have a different intuition. Anytime I debate with determinists, they're always like, well, your view doesn't make sense. Like, what's the reason that determined you to make that choice? Or what's the reason that explains that choice? And it's like, it comes down to like, yeah, there are some desires and situations we don't control that scope and shape our choices. But why can't my will be the final arbiter between those competing desires? And I've never been given a definitive reason why it couldn't. I'm usually just told, oh, it just doesn't make sense. And it's like, okay, we have conflicting intuitions, but I don't see a definitive knockdown proof of free will.
Yeah. Well, I thought that was a really good response. I wouldn't go down the route of saying that it was random or anything like that. I guess, I can only really speak about my own mind here, but it to me that when if I am faced with two competing desires, staying at home, going to the movies, that my action will just be determined by which desire is stronger. My desire to stay at home is greater than my desire to the movies, then I will stay at home. And it does seem to me that I don't have much choice in that under that.
But could you control? So I agree with that. But could you? I think I can control my desires to some degree. Like maybe not all my desires. Like, oh, I want to go to the movies. I want to stay home. Like maybe there's a certain subset of desires that are competing, and that's out of my control. But among that subset, I feel like I really can pick between them. Like, why do I end up staying home and not going to the movies? Well, I desired to stay home, but I feel like I added that extra impetus there. I was in control of giving myself that extra boost.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from that response, I guess the argument from desire, it's not deductively proved, but it does seem that the first premise is, to me, it does seem intuitively true, just based on my own experiences. Yeah, it definitely seems that, in the analogy you gave, that my actions would be totally controlled by my desires. If I stayed home, it would be because my desire to stay home was greater than my desire to go to the movies. Like, and that would be a product of external causes. Like, I could look outside and see that it was raining in the sight, and that would cause my desire to stay at home to be greater than my desire to go to the movies, and that's kind of the picture I have of it.
Yeah, I think you can make the argument for sure. I think it comes down to one's interpretation, but yeah, I don't think it's deductively the case. But would you consider yourself a compatibilist then, or a hard determinist, or agnostic, or?
I'm not sure, but perhaps an agnostic. I do believe that the strongest argument against existence of free will is I don't know what it's more formally called, but I know of it as the argument from desire. That to me to be the most intuitively convincing argument against existence of free will. But I guess in your response that it's not necessarily controlled by the desires, could be another factor. Your free will, it's not deductively proved, but intuitively to me it seems convincing.
Yeah, it is intuitive, and I think it comes down to what's the origin of that extra desire. So the agent causation view is going to be that somehow we're the origin of that extra motivating desire. And to me, that better explains what I feel like actually goes on in my own psychological experiences. Like if I'm like, oh, I'm tired, but I also want to stay up and watch this debate or whatever. It's like, okay, I'm going to go with this. And it's like, yeah, that desire could have come from outside of me, or it could have come from inside of me. Like, I feel like at best, it's a standoff. To me, I lean more towards the view that I'm in control of it, but I get where somebody may not, but I think it's a standoff. But a lot of times determinists and free will defenders too will act like it's just obvious that it's one or the other. And it's like, no, this seems like a debatable question.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, my bigger objection, not my only, but probably my biggest problem with compatible. So I made that argument at the end of my free will video about physics and such, and I got pushback on that because I guess, my summation is that's more of an argument against hard determinism than compatibilism. But anyways, my biggest issue with compatibilism is it purports to still allow for moral responsibility. But if you really couldn't have chosen otherwise, then I don't see how one has true moral responsibility. They have moral responsibility in this societal sense, like we hold people accountable, but you're not really morally responsible if you couldn't have willed otherwise. Now, somebody could say, well, maybe we don't have that. But I mean, I feel like that's something I'm going to need a really strong argument to give up on, because I mean, that's a really integral part of my worldview and just the way we think about our relations with others.
Yeah. I mean, I think my sort of position on that would be that I guess that would come in two parts. The first is that I'm not, I don't really share the necessity for moral responsibility. I don't see that it's too important. And the other, I guess, is when you say that if determinism is true, then you really could not have chosen otherwise. But I guess I think the word "could" there may be a little ambiguous, because if we're speaking about possibility, if if the world was a different way, if physics was some other way, then yeah, and another possible world you could have chosen otherwise. But I guess if what we're talking about is physical possibility, given the laws of physics and the way the universe is, then sure, you couldn't have chosen otherwise. But going back to my first objection, the absence of moral responsibility does not seem to be a huge issue to me.
Right. So yeah, determinists will sometimes bring that up, like, oh, well, you could have chosen otherwise had your desires been otherwise. But it's like, yeah, but if the whole point is you're out of control of what your desires are under that view, then it's like, yeah, you could have done otherwise had things outside of your control. But yeah, it's not really what the free will position is. Yeah. But anyways, yeah, I mean, yeah, moral responsibility I think is really important, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I've got any more I want to ask, or brains to pick.
Sure. Did you want to talk about the ontological argument at all?
We can talk about that. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So the ontological argument, I made a video on as well, which I'm going to redo, but I think it's it sounds correct, or at least, no, it doesn't sound correct is a thing. It's hard to disprove, but I do think there's something wrong with it. So this might be something that we agree on. So the version that I like is God is the greatest possible being. A being is greater if it is necessary than if it is not necessary. A being that is necessary must exist, therefore God must exist. And if somebody pushes back on the word greatest, I think you could insert the word maximal, and that would work fine as well. So yeah, I have a couple of objections to this argument, but I'm curious what you think first.
So my problem, the first thing I would do is what you said, push back on greatest, and you could say that it's maximal, but again, I think that exactly the properties, I think it's maximal is a little ambiguous. The second thing that I would say, I would object to the assumption that existing in all possible worlds is greater than not existing in all possible worlds. I really don't see any justification for that. Yeah, I think that would pretty much sum up my response, except for that I don't see I don't see existing necessarily to be a property of a thing. I think that sort of that would lead to a contradiction.
Oh, it would lead to a contradiction. What would be the contradiction?
Yeah. So I might not be getting this right, but I think it was Immanuel Kant that raised this objection to.
Is this the passage that you had sent me a while back?
No, I don't think so. I think it's yeah. So there's sort of two different views to what it means for something to exist. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the property view, the quantifier view, the property view would to say that something exists, to say that it has the property of existence.
Yeah.
But to say that something has the property of existence seems to say that there exists. If we were to say that something does not exist, then what we would be saying is that there exists something that does not exist, or there exists something that has the property of not existing, and that would be a contradiction.
Right. Existence, I don't think is a real property, but necessity, even if you say that necessity is not a property, it could still be a proper qualifier. So like if I were to, it's like when we talk about whether something is contingent or necessary, I think there's a meaningful distinction there. So even if you want to say necessity is not an attribute of God per se, it would still be a proper description of the type of thing that God is. And I think that is coherent.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if it is true that God exists in every possible world, then it would be to describe him as existing in every possible world would be true. That would be a true description. But I think that existence not being a property is a bit of an issue for the ontological argument. because I think it is that premise is sort of framed that way. I do take sort of the quantifier view of existence, which is to say that if we say that something exists, we're saying that the number of things which the universe contains that are identical to X are, for example, 1 or 2 or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that way that sort of helps us escape from the conclusion of the ontological argument.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Yeah. Because the property view of existence leads to contradiction, and I think that that's what the ontological argument. I think that's what the ontological argument for God's existence assumes. Don't put that there. Where was I? Because that's what the property existence of God assumes. Let me try and rephrase that again. Because the ontological argument in premise 2 assumes the property view of existence, and because that leads to contradiction, that is a bit of a problem for the ontological argument. I take the quantifier view of existence, which is to say that something exists is to say that the number of things in the universe which are identical to X equals 0 or 1 or 2, and that to me does seem to pose a problem for the ontological argument.
Yeah, it sounds like you're taking the objection that existence isn't a predicate, then it's just like a description of what's proper.
Yeah.
I don't know how to frame it. Yeah, and I mean, I agree that seems correct. But I think that necessity is a little bit different than that, because necessity would be the view that we would just always necessarily, God would be a part of every possible world. I think that necessity is different, though. And I think most philosophers would agree on that existence isn't a predicate objection would apply to the original ontological argument, but not to the version that treats necessity as a property or description rather than existence. But anyway, go ahead.
What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think there's some more telling objections against the argument, though.
Yeah.
So we could talk about those.
Yeah. I mean, again, I want to get to those other objections, but I guess mine could just be summed up that I still think that even if we say that something exists necessarily, it still seems to be sort of subject predicate, and that leads to contradiction.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not convinced that would apply with necessity, but
the other objections overlay.
Yeah, so let's look at the other. So one of the objections I find interesting, and I don't see people addressing this, so I don't know if only Peter Van Inwagen has raised it, but he says, like, he objects to that the possibility of God is proven with the argument. And I used to find this objection to be kind of ridiculous, where somebody's like, well, maybe God's not even a possible being. And it's like, well, come on, like, that's just like, that just seems like that's ungrounded. Like, there's no contradiction in God. But what Van Inwagen argues is that, well, maybe it's at least conceivable that there would be a being that knows that God does not exist, that would be a possible being. And if that being is possible, then how do we know that God is possible and not that other being? And I think that there's a problem with that objection, because I think one could argue that a necessary being takes priority over a possible contingent being. So I don't know that objection works, but to me it is a tough objection. I don't see I haven't seen that addressed by any defender in the argument.
I don't know if this may have heard this before, but just in first impression of that, it does seem that objection wouldn't work to me for one reason, and that is that for this being to know that God does not exist, it must have a justified true belief that God exists, and knowledge, if we're going with a justified true belief definition, it would have to be assumed first that the proposition that God does not exist is false, or such that he could have a justified true belief that God does not exist. But if God exists necessarily in every possible world, then it's false to say that God does not exist, and therefore he could not know that God doesn't exist. This being seems to be impossible.
Right, I would agree that it's impossible, and so would Van Inwagen. But what Van Inwagen would argue is that the argument itself can't assume that God exists and that he's possible, because if in that possible world God didn't exist, then there would be a possible, and say somehow that being came to realize it, then in that possible world, God wouldn't be a necessity. So it wouldn't necessarily be part of our possible world, but in some other possible world, if a being realized that, then God doesn't exist in that possible world. But if somebody says, well, maybe that world's impossible, but then he would say, well, maybe it's impossible for there to be that God exists in every possible world then too. So, or maybe God's not maybe God's not a possible being after all.
Yeah.
But even now, as I phrase it, though, I'm still like wondering if that even goes through.
No,
because it's like, yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it does seem that if the ontological argument works, if all the premises are accepted, then it's the proposition that the proposition a possible world in which God does not exist seems to be contradictory. It seems that there can no, if the ontological argument is successful, then there is no possible world in which God does not exist.
Right. If it's successful, but Van Inwagen would be contesting the soundness of the first premise that it's possible. So the way I put it, that God is the greatest possible being. He's saying, well, how do you know that? And again, Van Inwagen is a theist, but he's saying, how do you know that God is possible? Maybe God's impossible. And if somebody says, well, come on, of course he's possible, and Van Inwagen would say, sure, I grant that, but maybe it's not possible that he's necessary. And then if somebody says, well, come on, of course that's possible, he would say, well, maybe not, because it seems like along that same reasoning, I can imagine it's possible that there's a type of being that knows that God does not exist, and that being would be incompatible with a necessary being with God. So he would say that you either have to say one of those two beings is possible, a necessary greatest being, or this possible being that knows God does not exist. One of those has to be ruled out, but which one are you going to rule out just based on the ontological argument? I'm not totally convinced by that objection, but it's an interesting objection.
Yeah. It does seem to me that if you just take a sort of conceivability approach to possibility and modality, that you could just say I can conceive that God exists, and there seems to be no contradiction in that, therefore it's possible. And that.
Right, but couldn't you take a conceivability approach to the being that knows that God does not exist?
So I think that sort of depends on your background. If you've already accepted the conclusion of the ontological argument, or any other argument for God's necessary existence, such as the contingency argument, that it seems that this being that knows God does not exist is impossible.
Right. But if somebody's not already convinced by God, they might think like, well, this other being is possible. Yeah. I mean, I think there's something fishy about that objection, and I think it might come in a category error and possibility and necessity. But anyways, that was the first time I'd only come across that objection once. Because a lot of times, like Craig and people in Alvin Plantinga bring up, like, well, somebody could argue that God's not possible, but that seems so ridiculous. Why somebody would argue that without an argument? But anyways, I'd come across an actual argument for that. But the bigger problem I see with the ontological argument is that it seems like this. You have to do so the way the argument works is we do this sort of conceptual analysis of what it means to be the greatest possible being. And I agree with the conceptual analysis, but like, how is reality going to do that conceptual analysis? And it's like, well, of course it's not. But to me, then how does the conclusion come out? It's like there's this grounding problem. It's like, it's not like there's some possible world surveyor that's like, oh, God has to exist because otherwise he wouldn't be the greatest possible being. And it just seems like it's almost like we need this other being to analyze what God would have to be and then make that all work out.
Yeah. Yeah,
that's where I've always thought there was something fishy about the argument, because it seems like it has that grounding problem.
Yeah, that's definitely weird. It's definitely weird. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've really any other problems with the ontological argument.
Yeah, but I think that it is fairly I mean, each of the premises to me seems correct on their own, and then when you put it together, it's valid. So it seems like it's a sound argument. To me, my biggest problem would be that final problem.
Yeah.
I see it as having a grounding problem, but I know not everybody agrees with me on that. But I think that's where a lot of people think like, well, there's something fishy about this argument, and they can't spot why. But to me, that's why it seems fishy.
I mean, maybe. I mean, I think perhaps very few people would agree with me here. But one other objection that I would have to the argument is the premise that what we have been talking about is that is it possible that God exists? I mean, I think we spoke about this the last time we were on here, but it doesn't seem to me that conceivability as a guide to possibility, that perhaps we can conceive of something, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the way things could have been. We may be able to conceive of God, but perhaps that just isn't a guide to what is possible.
Yeah, and I mean, I take conceivability as plausible unless there's a strong undercutting defeater to a conceivability. I don't like, if I can imagine something without contradiction, then I think that seems possible, unless you can give me a strong reason. But yeah, it does rest upon conceivability to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's sort of my final objection to the logical argument.
All right.
Yeah.
Were there any other arguments or anything you wanted to talk about? We could talk about fine tuning or anything else.
No, actually, I would like to talk with you about the fine tuning argument, but I was wondering. Well, I would like to talk to you about the fine tuning argument, but perhaps we could do that another time, because I need to go soon.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So let's set this up again sometime.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, StreamYard is much easier to use than OBS was, so I'm grateful that I found this. But all right, well, thanks for coming on. If anybody out there is watching or will watch, please click like and subscribe. And if anybody out there wants to have a debate or discussion with me or with Jordan, if you're open, you can message us, and yeah, we can get something set up. But all right, well, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on. Have a nice Christmas and stuff.
Yeah, thanks, you too.
Yeah.
Right, I'm gonna end it.
Right, cool. Right. See you.
Yep.